But the first question I wanted to ask you was just, obviously we've just had this massive weather event, and how will that in any way refocus your priorities going into the next council?
Well, I think at this stage it's actually a bit early to tell. We've got some significant damage across the region. Obviously Nelson's going to have a huge amount of refocusing to do because the impacts on Nelson City particularly have been very significant. For us, it's a bit early to tell, so I don't think it'll have a huge impact on our priorities. Clearly, responding to natural events has become something, unfortunately, as a region we've got used to in the last 5 years or so. But in this case, the Tasman region's probably dodged a bullet to a certain degree. So at this stage, I wouldn't see it being too significant. That's not to underestimate the amount of work that's going to have to be undertaken to put particularly roads, bridges and rivers right.
For sure. And has this in any way, if at all, changed your thinking towards Three Waters?
No, no, actually it hasn't. Look, I think Three Waters, I accept and our council accepts there has to be something different to the way that we deliver Three Waters services going forward. We can't continue as a region to fund $100 million plus projects on the rating base that we have currently. Equally, I don't think we're particularly fond of the model that's being proposed currently. The governance structure, which is highly complex, doesn't look to be particularly efficient. Both the number of entities, the size of the entities, and the shape of the entities. If we end up an Entity C, which stretches from Bay of Plenty all the way down to the top of the South Island, and the boundary that separates part of our region and part of the Marlborough region. So we got significant concerns about the proposed model, but I think we accept absolutely that there needs to be a different way of delivering infrastructure if we're going to be able to afford it as a region and a community.
And do you think councils have, and it's been a bit unclear in some ways probably for a lot of people, do you think councils can have any influence on that regional split at this point in time?
I mean, we've all made submissions. It remains to be seen whether they'll be taken up or not. I think again, we've taken a regional approach, so particularly around the boundary issue with both Marlborough, Nelson City and the iwi of Titauihu, and put that proposal up collectively. So we would hope that that has some traction. I felt we got a reasonable hearing at the Select Committee. We just have to wait and see. But I don't perceive at this stage there's going to be fundamental changes to the model that's being proposed. The government seems pretty wedded to the 4-entity model, so yeah, we just have to wait and see. It's like so many things at the moment. There's still more questions than answers, and there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about the detail because there's still at least one more bit of legislation, potentially two, before we finally see how it all fits together.
And that in the mix with the local government reform and everything else, I mean, it's going to be particularly busy for anybody who gets into that position. How do you sort of propose to maintain those, I guess, that good dialogue with central government?
Oh, look, I think that's one of the things that there is no no single biggest challenge. The biggest challenge of the next 3 years is how to manage all of the challenges that seem to be arriving at once. So central government reform is just one of them. The implementation of existing legislation, Te Mana o Te Wai, particularly around water quality management, is a huge job for a unitary authority like us that carries those regional council functions. My personal view is one of the small minor upsides of the whole COVID experience is there's a much better working relationship in this region between government departments, local government, businesses, NRDA, Chamber of Commerce. So those relationships have really built over the last 2 years, and I think the reform of local government, in my view, is heading down a path where those relationships are going to become even more important in the future. So yeah, that's something I've actually quite enjoyed, that shift, and I'd like to think that we can continue to grow in that. And it's really the only way we're going to address the significant challenges we have, whether it's climate change, whether that's biodiversity management, whether that's growth, housing, infrastructure development, is a collective approach. None of these things can be answered by either individuals or individual entities. So.
Yeah, that collaboration's been key, hasn't it? Which is it was been a really positive thing, I think, from the business community to have a bigger voice in that space, where I think in the past hasn't necessarily been so easy.
No, and there was always an upside to every to every crisis or every challenge, there's always opportunities that appear out of it, and that's been one of the ones that I think, and as a region, I think we've grasped that pretty well, probably better than some other areas, and that's partly down to personalities and people, and a willingness just to get out there and work collectively on the challenges and remain optimistic, which has been tough in the last 2 years. I mean, there couldn't have been a tougher 3 years to be in this role, but actually, as you look forward now, you can kind of see that there are advantages having been through it, looking forward.
Yeah, we're all at a bit of a high frequency at the moment, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Just getting a bit more granular on it, we often hear from businesses, particularly developers, that council can be difficult to work with, and that the rules and regulations and bureaucracy can be difficult to navigate. How do you see in the position as mayor that you can actually assist to make that relationship a lot easier so that businesses don't encounter those roadblocks?
I think it's always going to be a challenge. One of the biggest things is there's a, rightly or wrongly, there is a bit of a difference between the views of developers and often the views of communities in which they want to develop. And that's highlighted in places like Mapua, where the community has concerns about the rate of development, the type of development. So there is inevitably going to be a degree of not conflict, but disagreement over. Now, our role is to try and match those two up to ensure that we have an obligation through various central government legislative requirements, like the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, to provide more housing. I think we all understand that housing is a significant challenge for our region right across the board in so many different ways, whether it's affordability, the ability for people to get employees, for people to move and come in and start businesses. Housing is a big challenge. So I think as our district, we've actually delivered pretty well in terms of development over the last 3 to 5 years. And while that's come with challenges and a lot of costs, particularly around infrastructure, and certainly some difficult conversations with communities, both commercial, industrial, and particularly residential development has really gone pretty well over a period where, with COVID and everything else, supply chains have been challenging. So we've probably never built more houses than we have in the last 5 years. That doesn't mean we can't get better and improve, and one of the biggest challenges is how we encourage intensification, and it is still really difficult. Talking to developers and property owners, the option of doing intensification is still harder than it should be, and we have to get better at working with landowners and communities to make that happen. Like, it's great to see, if you drive around Richmond, particularly the central part of Richmond, the number of intensification developments that are taking place. But the feedback I get is it is still too hard. I guess the other thing we're kind of hoping is that the government's changes to the RMA, or replacement with the NBA and the Spatial Planning Act, is all intended to make our job easier, and hopefully to then make our relationship with developers, property owners easier as well. That remains to be seen, because like so many things, we've seen some high level information and some exposure drafts, and still to see the detail and how it might actually work. How
it'll play out. And I guess one of the byproducts of the development is the pressure on the roading network. And obviously, we see every day now going in and out of Nelson and around the region just how pressured that is becoming. What role do you think council can play in trying to help alleviate that, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, traffic and transport is it's a huge issue for our region, highlighted by the last 2 or 3 weeks in terms of when it's disrupted, particularly with significant disruption for a long period, whether that's our state highway networks in and out of the region, or whether it's the link between Nelson and Richmond. We are so reliant on road transport for both people commuting and all our goods and services coming in and out of the district. So it's been probably our single biggest frustration in terms of funding through Waka Kotahi, that it seems to be taking a very long time to get us to a point where that investment takes place, particularly on the state highway network. There is a significant amount of funding going into alternatives, so public transport, walking and cycling, and that's great. It's good for communities. It's good in a whole lot of ways, but it doesn't address the fundamental challenge, which is those arterial links are crucial. So our role is to continue to work with, encourage, support cajole, and perhaps you know, we might have to be a bit louder and a bit more forceful in saying what we need with Waka Kotahi.
And hopefully, but something positive out of the weather event may well be an increased focus on that as well. So
yeah, certainly on the state highway network and links in, whether that's going to have a significant difference on that arterial link. The two bits of work, the future access study, which is the Nelson chunk, and the Richmond program business case, which is the area from kind of through Richmond through that Gladstone Road traffic lights. At least they're now both in place, and there is a plan. We would like the plans brought forward and that investment to be done earlier. But like everything, you know, there's only so much money to go around, and you know, we're a small part of the country with a relatively small population, and unfortunately we don't tend to get prioritised in these conversations. So we've just got to keep making the case, and the community as well. So.
Just switching now to sort of wider economic development, what do you think council's role should be in that space? And thinking sort of particularly around, you know, we've got some industries that have been really hard hit by COVID, so tourism is one that's very obvious. What do you think council's position should be in terms of supporting economic development, promotion of the region, events coming to the region?
So I think that the primary thing we can do is do our core job well. So whether that's providing infrastructure that supports industries and businesses, whether that's providing processes and systems that if you're trying to bring an event or run something that, for example, uses our roads or needs access to certain things, that we can be proactive and positive and supportive in that space. When it comes to the tourism, there's obviously the promotion, our support of the development agency, but more importantly, it's actually doing our core role around protecting the environment, ensuring that the place and the reason that people come here in the first place is looked after, maintained, improved. So whether that's water quality, whether that's managing our lakes and rivers, whether that's looking after our biodiversity. So a lot of our core roles and our responsibilities around infrastructure, managing the environment, doing that the best way we can, and continuing to make this region the attractive place that it is to both live and come and visit. I think that's our core role, and that's where we should spend most of our focus.
And just sort of slightly adjacent to this is Nelson City Council recently voted against setting up a holding company. Is that something that you would encourage them to revisit? And, you know, bearing in mind we need a close relationship between the new councils, is that something you would encourage them to do, but knowing that TDC voted for it?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting conversations about having two councils in a region, and the assumption that we're actually very similar, and therefore it makes obvious sense to have one. Whereas in actual fact, what that decision demonstrates is a very different approach between the two councils, quite a different philosophical approach on a whole range of different topics. And I think that reflects the difference between a large rural area and a smaller urban one, and we have different priorities and different focuses. So absolutely, like I think that was my personal view, was a pretty simple decision. It's something that we should have done. The benefits over time were going to be significant. And yeah, if I get the opportunity, I'd certainly encourage it to be revisited.
And you don't think the fact that we have got two very different councils that reflect the communities possibly is a reason actually to have one council in order to have a better strategic positioning for the region?
Yeah, I think in some ways the question about amalgamation is almost yesterday's question. Yeah. There are so many changes either taking place or about to take place or going to be discussed over the next 3 to 5 years. So by the time Three Waters, if it proceeds, the RMA reforms and the changes around the whole governance and decision making in terms of future spatial planning, place making, decisions around that are going to be centralised or at least regionalised. Again, uncertain whether we're going to be combined with Marlborough, combined with Nelson, or remain 3 separate unitary authorities. The future of local government, inevitably allied with Three Waters and RMA reform, councils are going to look different. Structures are going to have to change. How that looks, I don't know, but I suspect there's just going to be a very different way of doing things. So I've been philosophically always kind of supported amalgamation. The challenge is the details and the actual proposal. And while it sounds good on the surface and simple, the presumption is you get the best out of combining two things. unfortunately, history tells you that actually sometimes you get the worst. And the things that you didn't like about whichever council you want combined are the things that end up, affecting the other one, and not the positive things that you might have wanted. So, my personal view is that right at the moment, there are so many changes taking place, many of which will deliver a lot of the benefits of amalgamation. I think the other thing is the conversations in communities around Three Waters, around RMA, are actually people aren't that keen on centralisation and growing these bigger entities. People actually seem much more interested in more community-based, and perhaps there's somewhere in there where certain decisions end up going to larger entities over time, but some of the more local community identity kind of decisions around parks and reserves and local community development actually may go to smaller entities, and it might be kind of a split between the activities that have been aggregated up in what we currently know as councils, turn out to be some go to a smaller level, more community based, and some go to larger entities. So it's going to be a fascinating time over the next 3 years to see how that all pans out.
And it's interesting because actually some people I've already talked to from Nelson City had almost exactly the same view. So there is actually agreement across the two regions, and particularly that the notion that it's yesterday's question has come through loudly and clearly, which I think is a really positive thing for the region. I've just got a couple of other sort of more specific questions. One is around the rating system. At the moment, Nelson City and Tasman District have got two different rating systems. Do you think that's something that should be looked at in the future, or is it just a...
I think it's a bit like the amalgamation question. I think so much is going to change. If the future of local government is going to have any chance of success in terms of changing the focus of what local government does and how it does it, it has to address how it's funded. A reliance on property taxes alone and direct charges are not going to be suitable for the direction that it seems as though the future of local government is heading. So the one thing that everyone's rating systems have in common is nobody likes the one they have, and everybody wants someone else's. And that's the same as looking overseas at different ways that people do things. But if you get, then you think, oh, that's a great system, we should look at that. You go and talk to people who live in that system, they go, oh, we hate the system. So I think how local government is funded is going to be crucial to determining what its role is and how. And it's clear that Three Waters are going to be charged directly from the new entities. How the RMA reforms and that is going to be funded in the future is still a bit unclear. So my personal view in this case is that I quite like our rating system mix. I think capital value is better than land value, and I think the mix of direct charges is also better than the differential model that's used to kind of modify land-based rating. But I don't see a great appetite for changing, and it creates such upheaval because inevitably whenever you change it from one to another, it very much shifts the incidence of rates. And as you can see actually in Nelson City with the recent changes with the valuation impacts, although the underlying rate increase was not huge, for many people it meant quite large rate increases.
Yeah, the percentage was high. It was a shock, particularly in the commercial sector.
And the commercial sector, and that's driven by the differential model, whereas the capital value model doesn't have quite those significant swings.
So the last thing I'm going to ask you, it feels a bit redundant. How many years have you been on council now? For about longer than you probably care to remember.
But 20 odd.
20 odd years. So if you were to say in less than a minute why people should vote for you and why you should be the Mayor of Tasman, what would you say?
Look, I think it's been an incredibly challenging 3 years to be the Mayor. I thought coming into this that having all that experience, I probably knew what I was getting into, and it turns out that actually I've learned a hell of a lot in the last 3 years. I think the collaborative approach I take, the ability to build teams, the fact that over the last 3 years we've faced some real challenges as a council and managed to stay together and be pretty cohesive, vigorous debates, really different opinions, but largely we've managed to come through in a really collective fashion. So I'd like to think I've played a small part in that. I take a regional approach to issues, and I think experience is going to be important. There's going to be a lot of changes around both council tables in our collective region, and having some continuity and experience, given the challenges we're going to face in the next 3 years, I genuinely believe that I'm in the best position to deliver.